right, moving along because we've got a lot of things to cover. And this week's episode of Dark Side of the Ring was on the Junkyard Dog. And you know what I think besides the Ernie Ladd comments, I think all the talking heads let us down. Because this didn't really profile his wrestling career from start to finish, nor did it necessarily tell us the story of his athletic career pre-wrestling, including the time that he walked out due to discrimination off of his high school football team?
Yeah.
And then the heartbreaking story of him going to his daughter's graduation, missing it, and then turn around trying to drive back home and getting killed in the car wreck was neither fully fleshed out nor explained at the end, to the point where it was as tragic as it was in real life. But the whole focus, it seemed like, was trying to say that JYD was the greatest black wrestling star of all time, or African American, depending on who phrased it. But I think in the end, it shortchanged us on the story, and too many people were talking that were, DiBiase was around Dog quite a bit. And I guess, Tony Atlas and Coco and Jake and those guys were especially in the WWF. Jim Duggan, got no problem with him, but I think it wasn't focused. And it wasn't that what I was going to say was that they shouldn't have been saying he was the greatest black wrestling star of all time. He was bigger than that. He was as big as any of the white guys. I think they should have focused on he was one of the biggest in his peak wrestling stars of all time. And I loved the Ernie Ladd comments, because Ernie's gone, but this was from an interview he did years and years ago, because Ernie was close to Dog, mentored him somewhat as Booker there, saw the relationship between him and Watts. That was pertinent. Everything else was, just saying things that everybody already knew. I don't know. Let loose on it, and then we'll go through it chronologically.
I have my issues in general with the series and some of the decisions that are made with it. I thought this was disappointing. It just wasn't a coherent story. They relied too much on Jake. There's things that Jake can add to. Jake was there in Stampede. Jake was there in New Orleans. But Jake wasn't there in Mid-South Wrestling in 82, 83, 84. So he can't really speak to any of that, but he kind of was.
He wasn't there when Dog left.
And again, the story was just disjointed. All of a sudden in the middle of it, they went back to talk about his childhood. I was like, all right, good. I thought they were going to talk about him leading the walkout. Here's something to show. No, nothing about that. Surprising. I also thought they kind of when I say they, the talking heads and then editing that into the show misrepresented a lot of things about his WWE run. He came in, he was instantly, if not number 2, the number 3 babyface in the company. And I questioned 2 versus 3 because Slaughter was still hot off the Sheik feud. But he came in and he was pushed as a top guy right away. His theme music was over. He was over. Vince was screaming about him dancing with kids in the ring.
One of the first round of action figures.
Actually round 2 of action figures.
One of the first round.
Yeah, round 2 of action figures. Intercontinental title match at WrestleMania, first pay-per-view wrestling classic at the end of 85. He wins the tournament, beating Randy Savage. After that, it wasn't... See, they presented it like he started doing more drugs because he wasn't happy with how he was being used. How he was being used, in part, was because of the shape he was getting in and what he was doing. Remember, they put him in the feud with the Funks because they knew that Terry would be able to get something out of him, because Terry could get something out of anyone.
But also, he was still being used on top in Mid-South in 84, and when we've done the Mid-South discussions and everything we've talked about, how the Dog of 81, 82 wasn't the Dog of 84, or vice versa, however you would say that. But he was still being used on top, but he was using drugs then before he went to New York.
And remember, they tried to get that over. Watts on commentary would talk about the dog bulking up because of the big competition.
Yeah.
How is he going to beat King Kong Bundy if he doesn't bulk up?
And I'm sure if he'd have ever got Dog to get back in the gym and lost the weight, he would have said, well, look, he's leaning out to try to fight the big fat guy.
That's exactly right.
But, that's the thing is, and Jim Ross had some pertinent comments because he was there through the whole run. And, they showed the early clip of JYD when they were still doing studio wrestling in Mid-South and Shreveport with his original gimmick. He brought the wheelbarrow with all the junk from the junkyard to the ring. And that's what started getting him over. But you could see the Mid-South footage of him with the power slams, the thump and the entrance and the people going crazy and the barking and the body that he had and the intensity. And just, it was not just the right guy in the right moment. He had all the fucking tools and the push and everything. And they tried to replicate that in New York, but and let's face it, at the time, the difference in the Mid-South in-ring style and the WWF in-ring style couldn't have been more pronounced. You went from one of the hardest places to work in the ring to one of the easiest, and he still couldn't, keep up after a while with that. And boy, the one clip of him with the really short hair and the little finely groomed mustache and his face big, he looked like a guy in a sitcom, not the Junkyard Dog that looked like he was a badass 5 years before that.
That pissed me off about WrestleMania 3. He wrestles King Harley Race with Queen Fabulous Moolah and Bobby Heenan in his corner. Because Samantha Fox pulled out, so they needed a woman to go to the ring, and they pulled Moolah into it. But the dog, he didn't have the fro, even the tightly groomed one. He got rid of the beard. All of a sudden, he looked like a different person. Even when he gained weight, when he still had the beard and the mustache and a little bit of hair, he still looked like the Junkyard Dog.
Yeah.
But WrestleMania 3, he had a weird look that didn't work.
And, all respect to Tony Atlas, but I'm not sure that the girls in Louisiana were very friendly to the boys. But I don't know that I heard and certainly never experienced.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about this, yeah.
Any of the girls, I mean, it's happened on limited basis, but it wasn't like Tony Atlas is talking about like as a regular thing. Oh yeah, I'll bring these. You need some money here. And he'll have several girls come over and pay $100 a piece. $100 in 1984 was about $300 or $400 today. And I don't know that most of these girls could afford it. Now, we have heard stories.
How much was ringside?
$8 to $10, $12.15 if it was a scaffold match or the last Stampede. We've heard stories of certain individuals in the wrestling industry transitioning into gigoloism, or there's been some well-off benefactors, female benefactors of certain wrestlers, but it wasn't like a thing where you could just call, hey, oh, you need some money? Here, I got some girls that come up. No, I'm sorry. And I will say that Junkyard Dog in Mid-South was probably making, in 1984, if he'd have stayed the whole year, he would have definitely made more than we did because he was a single and the money wasn't getting split up 5 ways. It was getting split up 2 ways. Two guys in each tag team and a manager versus 2 guys in a single match. He would have made 125 or 150 that year, maybe. But he probably also, during the big run with the birds and the blinding thing, he was easily at 125 or more in Mid-South, just that territory. And the outdates he was making, during that early period where he got hot before Houston officially became part of Mid-South, 125 to 150 grand a year, which would be, again, 3 times that in today's money. And I definitely know that he was still talking about, and everybody was still talking about, when we got there, the scuttlebutt in the locker room was that Dog's week for the dog collar match at the Superdome, and whatever else they did that week was $12,000. So figure that.
That's how he got that Mercedes.
Well, I was about to say $35,000 to $40,000 week in today's money, and he used to drive around in that Mercedes. He called it, "That's the car that Cowboy bought me," because he went out and bought a fucking Mercedes with his week's paycheck.
Hey, the story, because I'd never heard it before, that Teddy Long told about the dog saying he was in a bathroom stall and he heard Grizzly Smith and Bill Watts having a conversation, and Bill Watts called him the N-word. The reenactment, which was a bit over the top, had the dog kicking through the stall and some big fat guy walked through. I don't know who that guy was. Had you heard that story before?
No. And see, here's the thing. And you know, I love Teddy Long, and Teddy and I have never had a crossword, and I believe that he believes that, because JYD told him that. The problem is that what was, and also remember, Teddy didn't get into business until as a referee, 87-ish, 8-ish. He was refereeing in Atlanta TV, and so he would have been around Dog in the WWF. He would have been around Dog when Dog came to WCW the first time in 1990, when Teddy was managing, or 89,
88.
Right? No, 88. That's right. He was in 88 real quick. But regardless, 88, 90, that period of time in WCW, it was several years removed. But basically, what do you expect JYD to say? They spent all the time on the program showing pictures and having everybody from JR to DiBiase, all the other people say how close Watts and Dog's relationship was, that Watts took more time with him than anybody, that he groomed him and made him to be the star, and blah, blah, blah. And when Teddy said that, they asked Watts for comment. They had the graphic on the screen that Watts said it was complete fiction, never took place. And I believe that, because for several reasons. Number one, Grizzly Smith, despite all of his other issues, was the best stooge in the world. His job was to report if he heard anything to Bill Watts that would be detrimental to business. And because he was the best stooge in the world, he was usually right about these things. If Grizzly Smith had gone to Watts and said, "We think we're going to lose the Junkyard Dog, he's going to go to New York," Watts would not have blown him off. Watts would have said, "Why do you think that? And what do we need to do? And should we get Dog in here and talk to him?" Or something like that. He wouldn't have been so frivolous. He wouldn't have used that language about JYD.
Yeah, the war.
But he also wouldn't have blown off the goddamn thought or the concept either. Because remember, Watts was more wounded and surprised than anybody. Nobody knew Dog was going. And it just suddenly he was gone.
Bobby Fulton once told me, because he was in the babyface locker room with Junkyard Dog, that he remembers like Dog coming in like, gotta get ready for the fight. We gotta fight Vince. And then like the next show, he wasn't there.
Yeah.
It was just like that.
And so anyway, the point is, he would have questioned that. What's going on? He didn't know anything. He wouldn't have used that language about JYD. He wouldn't have been so frivolous. But here's the thing, what I was going to say. JYD had to say, he didn't want to say, "Yeah, this guy made me a fucking fortune and gave me this spot, and I was one of the biggest stars in the world, and he paid me enough in a week. I bought a Mercedes and blah, 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 and I left him with no notice and went to work for Vince for more money." So he created a backstory that the audience that he had would easily, "Well, you did right." But nobody else has ever heard that story from any, or didn't hear it when it happened, or for years after it happened. And it doesn't fit for a variety of reasons. And, and then again, the guy that the booker that Watts primarily relied on to help him with JYD was Ernie Ladd. And remember, he actually fired Ernie as his booker when he first brought JYD in, because Ernie didn't get it. And then he brought him back however a few months later, whatever the fuck. But Ernie told me his story himself, and he's told it on tape. Watts brought JYD in, sent him down to New Orleans. I think they were at the St. Bernard Civic Center that night. And so Ernie calls Watts the next morning, as he did in the morning after every show. Well, boss, your boy don't have it. What do you mean? That Junkyard dog, he don't have it. He worked with Scott Irwin, the Super Destroyer. I put him 20 minutes through to see what he had, and halfway through his tongue was lolling out like a long red necktie. The boy can't go. I'm telling you, Bill. And fucking Watts said, you're fired. And Ernie said, and besides that, what? Say, you're fired. I sent my new top star down there so you could see what he could do, not what he couldn't do. You're fired. And Ernie said, point taken. So they put him in a ring for 5 minutes, had him power slam people, and he got over. But so anyway, no, that was JYD trying to just tell some guys stuff to get heat off himself in the locker room years later.
If JYD hadn't left Mid-South in 84 for Vince, and again, Mid-South was a rough territory for the Drive, and he was a top star.
Yeah.
And he'd been doing it for years, before Oklahoma got swallowed into Mid-South Wrestling, and then afterwards. What do you think he would have done? He was already he was one of the last touring territory stars, because at the very end there, went to Florida, was in Georgia for a while, showed up in Mid-Atlantic in 84.
Memphis,
was on the Parade of Champions for World Class, was on other World Class shows. So he was going to various places. He was in magazines. Not only because he was the star of the Louisiana territory, but also because he was a black wrestling star. It was amazing. He was on the cover of magazines. His pinup was in Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Pinup.
And he was very sexy too.
But he was one of the last guys, like a Kamala too, who the gimmick started working and he started going to different places. If JYD hadn't gone to Vince in 84, do you think he's staying with Watts until Watts closes up? Or do you think, is he someone Dusty would have wanted to bring in? Is there any other option for a JYD?
No, yes. You asked 17 questions. How do I answer them? Dusty would have definitely, besides a weight or drug or reliability problem, let's say you mentioned the trips and the schedule plus his out dates, and Dog had Pee Wee Anderson driving him, and it got to the point at the end where Dog was doing more out dates. He wasn't going to fucking Cochetta, Louisiana or whatever and being on a spot show. And obviously, the more big towns he made, the more money he was making. So he was going to, as I said, if he'd have stayed in 84, plus all the other stuff he was doing, he would have easily been making over 150 grand a year. And still, with those trips, DiBiase told me himself one time, he said, I spent 18 months in this territory, and I hated the wrestling business, and my hair started falling out. I had to go somewhere just to keep my sanity, because it would wear you down, and the fights with the fans and the style in the ring and the trips in the car, and it was just insane, right? But Dog had a driver, and he was doing more out dates, and the level of star that he was, if he'd have kept in condition and, been right by 1986, Dusty would have had to have him. And Watts was, by then, his business, the economy in the core territory, blah, blah, blah. We've told that story. He wouldn't have been able to pay Dog that money or that kind of money, but Crockett would have. So if Dog hadn't gone to work for Vince, he definitely would have ended up in Jim Crockett Promotions. And again, for fuck's sake, North and South Carolina, Georgia, the heart of Crockett Promotions and the core territory had incredible populations of black fans.
He would have been the biggest black star in the history of Crockett Promotions if they brought him in any time between 84 and 86.
Yeah. And he was equally as over with the white fans also, so it would have been just another big name coming in like they were trying to get all the other big names. But in this case, you would have had a guy who was tailor-made for the core audience of the core territory, and Dusty would have seen that because Dusty was one of the biggest heroes to the African-American community in Florida and Georgia. You've seen the pictures. When he went to Detroit and won the U.S. title working for the Sheik, they fucking leaped in the ring and they couldn't pick him up. But they were swarming all over him, hugging him and kissing him, and all the pictures I think Brad McFarlane took. It's insane. So, yes, Dusty would have seen that as long as Dog was in shape and could still, make the towns. He didn't even have to be. I mean, Dusty used Jimmy Valiant past Handsome's athletic prime because people loved him. So JYD with the Horsemen around wouldn't have even had to have worked like he did in the old days. Now, they brought him in 1990 and tried to have him work with Flair, and that was abysmal. But they
made it about race, which it killed it right away.
Well, and that was Ole.
Yeah.
But that was 4 years later than 1986. And at that point,
he was still over. If you go watch
he was still over.
Yeah.
He just couldn't go anymore. But yeah, he would have been on Crockett's roster for sure if he had not gone to Vince. There was no place else that could pay him the money that he would have wanted and been able to draw.
Yeah, that 1990 match with Flair at the Clash was considered at the time, and I haven't watched it in years, the worst Flair match of the era. No one could remember a worse Flair match. And remember, one of the saddest things, when they did the Superdome in '89, Flair Steamboat 2 out of 3 falls, they had Butch Reed versus the Junkyard Dog on that show. And the Dog came out with a band, a whole New Orleans thing. There was no one there. Like, even his fans were gone by that point from New Orleans.
Well, to be fair and to be honest, at that period of time in WCW, all the fans were gone from everywhere. But anyway, and also they made it sound like Vince Jr. didn't, and this was a Coco, and I love Coco to death, but Coco Ware, until he went to the WWF, had probably never fucking seen a show, heard a result, seen a program, whatever. He's going from what he was told pre-1980, what was it, 5, 6, whatever.
He went in 86.
Okay. But they made the point that Vince Sr. used a lot of black wrestlers. There were wrestlers of color, and they showed a bunch of the pictures. And then Vince Jr. switched, and, everybody's white. Well, again, there's a nuance to that nobody was, and I'm not trying to defend Vince McMahon Jr., but from this I am, because it was bullshit the way that the talking heads phrased it. Vince Sr. was promoting the Northeast, not the whole country. And so, yes, when he had Johnny Rods, or he had, he was going for Puerto Ricans, Italians, African Americans, and somewhat of the Polish, right? He wasn't going for fucking rednecks. The hillbillies were the furthest thing from an act, as they say, that would draw actual hillbillies.
The way they laid it out here was pretty funny too, because like Vince Sr. had all these guys. Pedro Morales for the Latinos.
Yeah.
Bruno Sammartino for the Italians. The Wild Samoans. And I'm like, wait, for who? The Samoan people? These guys who can't speak English, who just talk gibberish and eat bones?
Well, that's another strongbow, I think, for the massive Northeastern Native American population.
Yeah.
But it was streamlined to a national modern promotion. And some of those gimmicks went by the wayside, and some of those people went by the wayside because they weren't major stars. And then, we'll go ahead.
If Junkyard Dog showed up in WWF in 1984 and saw what was going on, whether it was right or wrong, and just started working out like crazy, and however much he can get back into good shape, he got into good shape, got on the gas, everything. Would Vince have ignored that, or Vince have pushed that? If he looked like he did in 1981.
Oh, he would have pushed that like crazy. Ahmed Johnson. Vince was going to give anybody that looked great body wise a chance, whether they could work or not, and a lot of times whether they could talk or not. And Dog could look great, and Dog could talk at an upper echelon. So, and he could work if you worked around him, as DiBiase mentioned. So he was. If Vince was in love with Ahmed Johnson or a few other people that we could go up and down rosters and name, he would have pushed Dog to the moon if Dog looked like 1981 Dog and was talking like that. And the promos alone, I think at the end, I don't know whether Dog had just given up or whether he's burnt mentally or with the whole thing or whatever. But also when he had something to, and maybe he did, I'm sure he didn't take scripting well or being told what to say. Watts would tell him the topic to talk about, and he would do whatever it was like the Dog would do it, right? And I sat in on a few of those. Well, you saw the clip of me. I told that story for the Tales from the Territories series, but they put it in this program that, and they showed the footage of him. The rib when he snatched me around the neck on the Mid-South TV when I was confronting him, and he's going to grab me and give me the hangman. He's going to lift me up by my neck with one arm, right? But the rib was the Midnight Express are supposed to run in and attack him, but they couldn't leave the locker room until he had grabbed me or the people would tip it off, right? And remember in Shreveport, that boys club, you had to come down the long row of stairs and then run across half a basketball court to get to where the ring was. And he had to fucking hold me. So he snatched me around the neck and I grabbed his wrist and up we went, and he's choking me and my eyeballs are popping and I'm trying to brace myself up on him. And I see the boys and they're still 60 yards away. I'm like, and I could feel him weakening a bit, but he had me up for that until they got the boom. But God, that was a rib on him. He had to hold my satchel ass up with one arm for about 30 seconds. So anyway, where was I going with that? Oh, the promos. That was the thing, is he was a natural at talking to people, and the smile that wasn't fake, or when he got mad face, that wasn't fake. You believed he was mad. And he could come up with shit. It wasn't like, he just did a dry promo. He was fucking witty and he was funny, and he could do the inside promos, ribbon on. We would sit there in Shreveport at Channel 3 from 9 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon doing local promos for every market, the baby faces and the heels, whoever was featured. And then we had to leave and drive 200 miles, go to a town and work that night, right? And most of us that lived in Alexandria had driven up that morning, left the house at 6:30. So it was a long day. So he liked to, as many of us did, entertain everybody. And every time that we got to the Jackson, Mississippi promos, that's when all the boys would sit down and watch. They'd come back from the Coke machine, conferences behind camera would end. Have I told you about the George C. Culkin promos?
Oh, I know about those.
Yeah. Well, because you're a Mid-South fanatic. But George C. Culkin was the promoter in Jackson, Mississippi. He had wrestled as George Curtis. He was Jack Curtis's, was it his father or his uncle?
I think it was his uncle.
Yes, because George C. Culkin, his brother was Jack Curtis.
Right, he's Jack Curtis Jr.
Jack Curtis Sr., Jack Curtis Jr. was his son. It generally happens that way. So anyway, wrestling family, but they'd moved into promotion. George C. Culkin owned Jackson, Mississippi. That's why when he and Watts were on the outs, the Culkins, the Curtises, operated Mississippi as their own territory, and it, was not part of Mid-South. Politically, they were connected, and they'd been there for 30 years, right? But when Watts started using Dog and sending Dog to the main event in Jackson every show, as legend had it, George C. Culkin called up the Cowboy and wondered why he's sending that N-word up here on top of my cards all the time. Because if you can imagine any Civil War plantation owner, you could cast George C. Culkin in the part, right? So every week when we're doing the local promos, if Junkyard Dog was on the Jackson promo, he would be up there with Reeser Bowden or Jim Ross or whoever at the podium, and I can hardly wait to get up to Jackson, Mississippi again. You know, I was there last week, and I was sitting on the front porch of my good friend, Mr. George C. Culkin's house, and we was eating some fried chicken and watermelon. And I was saying to him, George Culkin, it's going to be a sad day when I get a hold of that no-good hacksaw Butch Reed or whatever he's doing. And he's just driving George Culkin out of his mind at every time that he would call Watts and go, why is he talking about me? George is your town drawing. Are you making more money than you've ever made in your life? And, you know, the promos were worth listening to for the boys and the fans. He could fucking entertain people. So, and the one thing that I thought about, of course, at the end of the episode, they made the point that he went from working a Superdome to working at Walmart in 10 years, which is, you know, sad. But can you think that he died in 1998? 5 years later, when the Fan Fest started and the Legends reunion shows and the comic conventions started crossing over to wrestlers, he would have had a second career. He could have made a fortune doing all that shit. Because not only because of his name value and his entertainment factor.
Yeah, and again, if you grew up in the 80s, even if you weren't a wrestling fan, you may see him a little differently because he was on that cartoon. That was on CBS on Saturday mornings.
Yeah.
He was and his action figure was everywhere. And if you were a kid who wasn't white and you were a wrestling fan and you wanted a wrestling toy, there was very little representation. It was him, eventually Tito, but that was it. I mean, the Iron Sheik, I guess, technically. And, well, now I'm just going by what country.
I was about to say, did you, if you were a kid, did you want to represent the Iron Sheik or be represented by the Iron Sheik?
But, you know, for baby faces, for a good guy, whatever you want to call it, JYD's action figure was a big deal. And, you know, every kid had to have that when I grew up.
Plus, he did a duet with Vicky Sue Robinson, for fuck's sake.
Grab them cakes.
That's right. Anybody that stood next to Vicky Sue Robinson is okay in my book.
You know why I hate that song? Because it replaced Another One Bites the Dust. That was their attempt we need to do something because we're not going to pay Queen.
Yeah.
Let's have the dog do a song with Vicky Sue Robinson.
But no, honestly, a dog, he was great to work with. He wasn't great. He was easy to work with. By the time we got there, you know, as we mentioned, he had slowed down and etc. So the matches were easy every once in a while. The big fucking spot in a Superdome, there's 23,000 people there. Watts has beaten up Bobby and Dennis and got juice on them and beaten them and thrown them out of the ring. And to get me in the ring, to strip me down, take my clothes off, put me in a diaper and feed me a baby bottle, once again in front of 23,000 screaming people, JYD is going to give me the slingshot over the top rope. So there I am. I jump up on the apron and I'm right in the middle and I'm holding on. And boy, when he hits that rope, I'm going to fucking fly, right? And I swear to God, I don't know whether he was hungover or what the effects were of what he'd been doing or if he hadn't been to bed for a few days. But besides the fact that Watts was mad in that match because Dog gave him the coldest flat-footed tag I've ever seen in a fucking tag team match. But then Dog goes to slingshot me. And instead of running and grabbing the rope where I was and giving me the big heave-ho in, he turned around and grabbed the top rope at the turnbuckle and kind of went, And I was, oh, shit, I had to do the whole thing myself. And it looked like a monkey fucking a football. It was fucking ugly. It looked like I just committed suicide of my own volition and launched myself head first over the top rope. But, so the matches were easy, but by that point they weren't barn burners, but he was fun in the locker room and everybody loved the Dog. Next week, Adrian Adonis. Did you love him, Brian? Because I never met the motherfucker.
I never met Adrian Adonis. I just finished his biography that I thought was a nice book. I'm interested to see how they do with it. Again, I was disappointed with the Junkyard Dog one. It felt like they had an idea and they didn't know how to complete it or put it together. It never really came together for me, but Adonis is an interesting story. So let's see if they get it right.
Well, that's the thing is, this'n. I sound like Aunt Lola now. This'n here, Jimmy. This one is going to be one that I'm interested in because this is another guy that I've never met. I never met Adrian Adonis once. We talked about Matt Bourne. I was at one or two TV tapings where he was in the building. I was never in the same place as Adrian Adonis. He's, again, one of the few people in the wrestling business, even as a photographer. So we were two ships passing in the night for 15 years or whatever until he met his untimely demise. So we'll see what happens. That's in 2 weeks, actually. Well, no, next week, because there's no dark side on the 4th of July. There's only light at the end of the tunnel.
That's actually the day Adrian Adonis died, the 4th of July.
Well, son of a bitch. You know what? You're right. They should have put that episode on the 4th of July to commemorate.
You wouldn't want to commemorate his death. You want to...
Well, in honor of this was the day. It's what better day to honor somebody? Hey, let's all remember when we loved this motherfucker and then he died.
July 4th was what? Adrian Adonis, Brutus Beefcake's parasailing accident, Joey Morella and Harvey Whippleman's car accident leading to Morella's death. I think there's another thing I'm not remembering right now.
I'm not leaving the fucking house.
Enjoy the fireworks.
Yeah, fuck you. I see anybody around here with a firework, I'm hitting them with a garden hose.